Now, when there's a washout or a whole body perfusion, this is the surgery that's done. They go through the femoral artery and the femoral vein are cut, and the perfusion solution goes backwards, reverse from the normal flow through the femoral artery up to the arch of the aorta, bypasses the heart, goes to the arch of the aorta throughout the body. In returning to the superior vena cava, it bypasses the heart again, goes down the femoral vein, and out the femoral vein to be recirculated. Next slide. So there's the blood. We've got two sets of arteries going to the brain. We've got the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. The carotid arteries are large arteries more towards the front, and the vertebral arteries are running up the vertebrae, and they're smaller and they're towards the back. And once they reach the brain, though, the flow from the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries get united in the circle of Willis to distribute through the whole brain. Next slide. Go back again. If you're doing a vitrification perfusion, in theory, you don't need to worry about the vertebral arteries, because you could just perfuse into the carotids, because it would get up there to the circle of Willis and go through the whole brain anyway. So that would make the vertebrals not so much of a thing to worry about because of this circle of Willis. Next slide. But the circle of Willis isn't always complete. As a matter of fact, most people do not have a complete circle of Willis. This study showed only 42% of cases have complete circle of Willis. It's most often complete in women and young people. And another study was a bit more optimistic, looking at healthy people aged 65 to 68, found that just only a little bit less than half had a complete circle of Willis. So how do we do vitrification if the circle of Willis isn't complete? Next slide. Well, you have to try to go through the vertebrals as well as the carotids, it seems like. Now, when Alcor does a head perfusion, they separate the head from the body, and then they put the head in a container that filters and recirculates the vitrification solution. And they perfuse through the carotid arteries. Initially perfusing through the carotid arteries, let's put it that way. They only perfuse into the vertebral arteries if they don't see perfusate dripping out of the vertebral arteries. So if they see dripping perfusate, that means the circle of Willis should be complete. Otherwise, how could it be coming down the vertebral arteries? If they don't see the dripping perfusate, then they would cannulate the vertebral arteries and perfuse through both the vertebrals and the carotids. And this procedure also is good. It allows independent monitoring of each hemisphere. Doing the head independently in this box has this advantage that you can look at each hemisphere independently and make sure each hemisphere is being perfused. Next slide. So Alcor, when they're doing their head perfusion, they put holes in the skull, which are called burr holes, which allows them to monitor brain shrinkage and cracking on cooling. So it actually turns out the vitrification solutions they're using, if the patient doesn't have ischemic damage, and the blood vessels aren't leaky, the vitrification solution doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier well. It doesn't get into the brain. And an Alcor patient who has very little ischemic damage is mainly vitrified by dehydration rather than the vitrification solution. And so they're watching through these burr holes, they're watching the brain shrink, and they consider that the brain's been vitrified after it shrunk to 78% of its original volume. Next slide. As I mentioned, before 2005, the Cryonics Institute was only perfusing through the carotid arteries, and glycerol is what was previously used. But anyway, only perfusing upward through the carotids to perfuse the head and downwards to the carotids to perfuse the body. And these are the cannulas that we use and are still used. Next slide. And as far as the surgery, what we're trying to do now, what we've been trying to do since 2005 is get those vertebrals into the vitrification perfusion. And so we try to perfuse into the ascending aorta. We open the chest, perfuse into the ascending aorta, clamp off the subclavian arteries that are going to the arms, clamp off the descending aorta that's going to the body, and that way, just by perfusing into the ascending aorta, the vitrification solution can go through both the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. Next slide. So the United Kingdom has requested, people in the United Kingdom don't like the idea, and of course everybody in Europe doesn't like the idea of spending 3 days in ice before you get your vitrification perfusion in Michigan. And as I indicated, it's not very good perfusion when you've got a lot of cold ischemic damage anyway, even though we're using a vitrification solution. So in January I sent Cryonics UK people some vitrification, some of the CI vitrification solution. And the protocol I have is for them to perfuse the head with vitrification solution through the carotid arteries. There's no perfusion provided through the vertebral arteries. And the patient would then be shipped to the United States in dry ice. So what does this mean for the patients with incomplete circle Willis? Well, one thing you can say is perfusion after 3 days in ice. And just by going through the carotids, you're going to get a better perfusion than you might get otherwise. You probably get otherwise. At least you get good vitrification in many areas, even if not in all areas. That could be one argument. But there's actually more to the story than that. Next slide. So actually, out of about 15 to 20 neuro cases that Alcor has done, in no case have they ever perfused to the vertebral arteries, because they had never seen, in all cases, they see dripping of the vitrification solution through the vitrification arteries. So I don't know, what sense do we make of this? Well, actually, a couple of years ago, there was a study done showing subjects, 60% of which had an incomplete circle Willis, which is pretty typical. But during unilateral perfusion, with functional testing, they showed no evidence of insufficient perfusion of any parts of the brain. So there must be some extracranial collateral circulation going on. And if that's the case, we've been wasting an awful lot of time and effort trying to, in Cryonics Institute for sure, trying to perfuse through open the chest and perfuse through the ascending aorta, because it's very complicated and we often run into a lot of problems, and there's still a lot of bugs in the procedure, frankly. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk about the vitrification mixture. Oh, by the way, I just want to mention, this is such a critical paper, I brought a copy of it, if anybody wants to look at it. So, let's talk about the vitrification mixtures. Alcor uses a vitrification mixture called N22, and the Cryonics Institute uses one called VM1. They're both mixtures of cryoprotectants, as I mentioned, which makes them less toxic. They solidify at about the same temperature, minus 123. Next slide. This will show you N22. It's a very complicated formula, a mixture of cryoprotectants. So this is Cryonics Institute's very simple formula. They're both in carrier solutions. The N22 costs about $170 a liter. The CI's VM1 costs about $1 a liter. This is one of the reasons why that motivates closed circuit perfusion by Alcor, where they recirculate everything, and that's because they're using such an expensive vitrification solution. Maybe if they, as it is, they're spending about $16,000 a case on their vitrification solution, and if they didn't recirculate it, it would be astronomical cost. So they have to use closed circuit perfusion. Whereas, anyway, I haven't discussed closed and open circuit perfusion, but let's move on. Next slide. One reason why, this is more about the crime-sensitive vitrification solution. We use industrial grade ethylene glycol DMSO. Industrial grade, well, that's pretty shocking, but it isn't as shocking as all that because it's really about 99% pure. And the major impurity by far is water. And water is not an impurity, you know, for research labs and so forth. If they have an impurity, water impurity, that's going to cause them a lot of worry, but for us, water is just fine. We're using lots of water anyway. Next slide. So just to mention a little bit more, I mentioned already about the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barriers is blood vessels or capillaries around the brain, and they're less permeable than normal capillaries, and so that forms a barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is not very permeable to these cryoprotective agents unless it's been damaged by ischemia. And most of our patients, most cryo-sensitive patients, frankly, have suffered enough ischemia to cause them to be cause the blood vessels to be leaky. And so the cryoprotectants probably are crossing the barrier okay. So, and as I mentioned, where there isn't a lot of ischemia, the vitrification is mainly by dehydration rather than cryoprotective agents. Next slide. So I mentioned that the tissue solidifies about -123, but once you've got a vitrified solid, and you start cooling, the slow thermal conductivity of the solid from the outside means that the outside is cooling faster than the inside. And when the outside is cooling faster than the outside is going to contract more than the inside during the cooling. And that contraction is going to create thermal stress, which can cause cracking. And so cooling from -123 with the nice temperature, the faster you cool, the more cracking you can get. Next slide. Now, if you've got a very small sample and you cool slowly enough, you can avoid cracking. Dr. Brian Wolk has cooled a vitrified rabbit kidney, which is pretty small, only 10 milliliter volume, from -123 to -126 with the night chamber over 2 days. No cracking at all. So a very small volume, a very small organ, you don't have the cracking problem. Next slide. So in theory, if you cool the cryonics, in theory, if you were able to cool the whole cryonics patient, even the brain, slowly enough, from -123 to -126, you could also avoid cracking. But how slow would that be? We don't even know. It could be months, could be years, very long time probably. And it's just impractical for us to try cooling over that kind of time period. If we could somehow improve the thermal conductivity in brains or cryonics patients, that would help reduce the cracking problem, but there's no technology yet to do that. Next slide. So this is the protocol we've been using. Cool as rapidly as possible to about, this is a cryonic-sensitive patient where the lights cool about as rapidly as possible to solidification temperature -123, stay there for a few hours, and then cool as slowly as possible, or well, I don't know, as slowly as possible, cool over a period of days to a liquid nitrogen temperature. The idea is if you're going to cool if you cool very slowly, at least you'll get probably less cracking than if you cool rapidly. But we still know we're going to get cracking. Next slide. So actually, Dr. Grant Fay, a cryobiologist, did some experiments in 1990 with samples of about a half a liter samples, and he showed that below the temperature at which the sample solidified, you just can't avoid fracturing. Next slide.